It is a pleasure and with great anticipation at this time that I get to introduce our dear friend, family friend of Ner Tamid and a friend of San Francisco, a true gentleman of the city, Mr. John Rothman, who is so kindly given of his morning to be with us. John, I am so glad to see you in the way that we can do. Extraordinary. And just again, to give you my gratitude for sharing with us this morning over these next many minutes a little bit about the state of things, the conflict in Israel, the situation in the Middle East, and the current condition of world Jewry. I'm so glad to see you. Please, friends, let's welcome John. John, let's get you unmuted first.
Unmuted?
There you go.
Am I there?
There you are.
As you can tell, I work for Richard Nixon, so my skills at this are somewhat limited, but I'm happy to be with you. And whenever Rabbi Shana asks me to do something, I, of course, am delighted to do it. And I remember her before she was born, so to speak, and have known the family, of course, for a very long time. Well, when Rabbi Shana called me and asked me if I would say a few words, I have to tell you it's very difficult. At least we know now that the rockets have stopped flying. We know that in Israel there is a certain return to normalcy, but we also know that the residue of the war is clear. It was demonstrated, and I'm sure you all saw it in the headline of the J Weekly. And if you didn't see it, or you haven't read it, Faces of War, Fallout from the Israel-Gaza conflict. I've chosen this morning to speak about the fallout for us, for Jews in America. Many years ago, sitting in Ner Tamid, I had the privilege of listening to Eric Hoffer, the great longshoreman who became a leading philosopher. And maybe some of you were there that day, and you will remember his words. Everyone expects the Jews to be the only real Christians in the world. And one of the things that we have learned with this war is that Israel is under siege, but we are also under siege. And that is what I want to address with you. The story which broke last night, the chancellor and provost of Rutgers University apologized for an email they sent out condemning anti-Semitism as we see this huge rise. On Wednesday, the Rutgers University New Brunswick Chancellor Christopher Malloy and Provost Francine Conway sent an email to the student body condemning the recent rise in, frankly, Jew hatred. Some call it anti-Semitism. Let's be blunt, it's Jew hatred that has risen here in the United States. Some would say out of the conflict between Israel and the terrorist organization Hamas. A day later, I want you to know that the college leaders apologized for condemning anti-Semitism. Yeah, you heard me right. They apologized. Malloy and Conway sent a separate email entitled An Apology. They sent it out on Thursday to sincerely apologize for the first email condemning anti-Semitism, Jew hatred. The administrators said the intent of the initial email was to, and I quote, affirm that Rutgers, New Brunswick is a place where all identities can feel validated and supported, but added that the impact of the communication fell short of that intention. And then this line, in hindsight, it is clear that the message failed to communicate support for the Palestinian community members. Now, when I read this, I was deeply disturbed. Malloy and Conway wrote, the university was encircled by our vibrant diversity, and the diversity must be supported by equity, inclusion, anti-racism, and the condemnation of all forms of bigotry and hatred, including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. As we grow in our personal and institutional understanding, we will take the lesson learned here to heart and pledge to our community to doing better. The administration ended the email by saying they hoped to learn from mistakes along the way as they continued to make a beloved community in the university. Now, why do I begin with this rather depressing communication? I want to be crystal clear. It is completely legitimate to criticize individual Israeli policies. We know that, and I've done many programs at Ner Tamid about the fact that in Israel, there is a great diversity of opinion. People who support one position, oppose another position, and that's part of what we are. And in Ner Tamid, having participated in this community since 1968, when I came back from Israel in the summer with David Dallin, Rabbi Dallin's son, I realized there was diversity in Ner Tamid. There was a left, there was a right, and there were people who were ambivalent. All of Ner Tamid was united in the desire to preserve Israel. That was never a question. But what we are seeing now is a whole different dimension. When you can have attacks on Jews in Los Angeles, in New York, in Miami, when you can have attacks on Jews because they are Jews, when the slogans used are death to the Jews, death to Israel. And I want to reflect for a moment on the fact, as a radio talk show host, and all of you know I'm on KGO, just as Rabbi Shana's grandfather, the late great Ira Blue, was on KGO. I spent an evening the other night, which some of you may have listened to, in which the hatred of Jews was so real and alive, it scared me. Members of our staff who are not Jews were horrified by the hatred conveyed in emails and on the phone. And I felt compelled at the time to make it clear that you can criticize Israel, but when you criticize Jews, when you lump all Jews together, it's not acceptable. Now, be clear. The term death to the Jews is not acceptable. And I have to tell you that President Biden, in an eloquent message, condemned Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, and said there is no room in this country ever for bigotry or intolerance. But I want to speak now to the question which we are going to face in just a few weeks. Campuses are going to be back in session. And what happened at Rutgers is an illustration of what is happening on campuses across America. And that will accelerate in August and September as students, for the first time in, well, more than a year, are able to return to campus. To be honest with you, I'm startled, disturbed, and deeply upset. It is interesting to note it is not just from non-Jews. It is Jews who are also making comments. When I spoke with Rabbi Shana yesterday, in anticipation of this morning, I pointed out to her that our dear friend and teacher, Rabbi Brad Artson, felt compelled to write a letter to the members of his Jewish university located in Los Angeles. And in the harshest possible terms, Brad condemned Jews who were attacking Israel. Now, I have to tell you, Brad Artson is not a conservative. He's not a liberal. He's actually a very clear-thinking fellow who you know grew up here in San Francisco. And his wife, Ilana, they're a splendid couple, and they do marvelous work. And Brad, as a teacher, said, "What are you doing? You can be critical of Israel, but how is it that you now play into the hands of those who hate Jews. This is not an easy moment for all of us. I had the Israeli consul general on for an hour on the Thursday 2 weeks ago. You can hear it, it's in the archive on KGO. And one of the callers said, the Israeli army are like the SS. They're Nazis. And I sat back to see how the consul general would respond. And with great eloquence, he said, how do I respond to such an odious attack on Israel and on Jews? So let me explain to you, there are many who would say that we have a problem in terms of defense of Israel. Something I hoped I would never have to say. We now have to defend ourselves. Synagogues now have, in many cases, round-the-clock guards. You will note the stepped-up security at all Jewish institutions. I am not going to recite for you all of the horrific actions taken against individual Jews, whether they're sitting in restaurants, walking home from Shabbat services, walking simply in their neighborhood. But I can tell you this. What we feel here in the United States is being felt in Europe. My cousin Mark, who lives in Paris, who is a physician, has related horrific stories. And now there are those who say when they go out, they won't wear a yarmulke, or they'll take off their Star of David. They don't want to be identified as Jews because of fear. My father, as many of you know, was a refugee from Nazi Germany. There was something that I learned from him. In the 1960 presidential campaign, I was avidly for Richard Nixon. We can talk about that another time. And I wanted to put a Nixon for President sign in my window at our home at 620 Euclid Avenue. And my father said, nope, I don't want you to do it. I said, why not? He said, well, it's just not the thing you should do. It was, of course, his reaction, his fear of having a political visibility. Well, I argued with him. And finally, he conceded that I could put the sign in my window, in my room, if I chose to. But I realized something, and it came home to me in an essay by David Ben-Gurion. Actually, it was an interview that he gave with Moshe Perlman, but it was published in Saturday Review, believe it or not. And when I was in high school, at Washington High School, where Shana graduated and where her mother and father both taught for many, many years, I was in a course called Advanced Composition. And our teacher said to me, I want you in the class, the whole class, you're all going to read something, choose a magazine and read. Well, the magazine I chose, just sitting on top of the stack, was a Saturday Review. And it was an article by David Ben-Gurion entitled The Facts of Jewish Exile. And in that article, Ben-Gurion pointed out that when you live chutz la'aretz, outside of Israel, it is different than living inside of Israel. What we consider to be normal here would not be considered normal in Israel, and vice versa. We, Jews who live in the United States, the greatest, freest country in the world, understand what our rights mean. We now are under siege. We're under siege by a member of Congress who talks about Jewish lasers from Israel starting forest fires in California. We are under siege from those who, frankly, believe discredited ideas and theories. I don't, in this country, function in fear for expressing my political views. I have never put my head down. I've never been silent. But there is a danger of silence in our own community. whether it is in the broader community, whether it is on the campuses of America, whether it is in our own institutions of higher learning. Let me explain that because of Israel, I am freer to be a Jew. Because of Israel, we have Jewish summer camps, we have Jewish high schools, we have Jewish schools in general. We have people committing themselves to the future of the Jewish people, whether we live in Israel or Chutz La'aretz, outside of the land. But what we are witnessing now is scary to many. A survivor of the Holocaust, and there are fewer and fewer in our community because of age, a survivor of the Holocaust called me and asked a simple question. Is it happening here? Do we have to be afraid here? She said to me, I was afraid in Europe. Do I have to be afraid here? And I believe the answer is no, we don't have to be afraid, but we have to be vigilant. When we see something untoward, we have to speak out, as we are entitled to do as citizens of this great country and as Jews. Never would I conceal my identity. And those of you who listen to me on KGO know that when this all started, I did a monologue in which I talked about the fact that I am a Jew. And yes, I am proudly a Zionist. I believe that the Jewish people are entitled to a homeland. And I support the Zionist movement's intention of creating a Jewish home. And more than that, I intend to do all within my power to maintain that home. I am freer because I live in a world within Israel. And those of you who remember the old days, when people put their heads down, I do not put my head down, ever. When I came back from the Soviet Union, and I spoke at Ner Tamid, and I spoke at a big rally at Stern Grove, about 8,000 people showed up to protest in 1969 for the treatment of Soviet Jews. I cannot tell you the number of survivors who came up to me, took my hand in theirs and said, thank you for having the courage to speak out. For me, it's not a matter of courage. For me, it is a matter of responsibility. We are all responsible for each other. I regret that on this particular Shabbat morning, having been invited to speak, that I must speak about this subject. But I don't want you to be depressed by it at all. I want you to be uplifted by it. Because as we can gather, as Jews, to celebrate Shabbat, or as we did last week, Shavuot, we also have the obligation, living in a free society, not to be silent. Once upon a time, Elie Wiesel, of blessed memory, wrote a book called The Jews of Silence. Many people interpreted the title of the book to speak of the Jews of the Soviet Union. That was not Wiesel's intent. The Jews of Silence were we, all of us, who did not speak out. The lesson that I have learned is that we must never be silent. And so I speak out today, clearly and precisely. I will not be cowed by Jew hatred. I will call it out when I see it. I am delighted that we have the support of many non-Jews who believe, as we do, in Israel's right to exist as a free, independent state, and for all of us to have the right to support Israel, maybe to disagree with certain policies, but to stand firm. So my lesson this morning, my Devar Torah, if you will, is we must be proud of who we are. We must demand that Israel live in peace and that we, as Jews who live outside of Israel, are able to live in security and peace in our own communities. Anything less is unacceptable. So I want to thank you for allowing me to offer these thoughts. And I particularly want to thank Rabbi Shana for the opportunity to address the congregation. Thank you, Shana.
John, thank you. Yashar koach. I listen to you, and the words that come to my mind are chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. Let us be strengthened by this kind of courage, this kind of erudition, this kind of strength that you bring to us. I am so grateful that you have such a large platform from which to champion the cause of Jewish existence, the cause of Jewish survival. It is not new that we face this abyss, this precarious knife edge of an existence that has always been Jewish life from our earliest days. For some, that can be disheartening, but for others, like myself and for you, and I think all in our beautiful, close-knit, small community, we strengthen one another when we remember how extraordinary is our survival each and every day.
Shana, can I just quickly say, you call it a small community? Around the world, Jews are gathered in synagogues. They are gathered in Chabурot. They are gathered everywhere to celebrate Shabbat. So we're not small. And as for Ner Tamid, under your leadership and the leadership of the congregation, my hope is that it will grow and prosper.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for being so present. To me, you are friend John, Uncle John, but we are just so graced to have you at our fingertips, as it were. And I send
Anytime.
you a big hug
Me too.
and a kol hakavod.